You know, dear ones, there comes a moment in every woman's life when she looks in the mirror and doesn't recognize the person staring back. For me, that moment came at 72 years old, standing in my kitchen at 3 in the morning, holding a stack of legal papers that had just destroyed someone's entire existence. The worst part? I felt satisfied. Before I tell you this story, and Lord knows it's a heavy one, please hit that subscribe button. These tales from my generation need to be heard, need to be remembered. We lived through things that would break most people today, and somehow we survived. Sometimes we survived by becoming the very thing we once feared. Hit that like button too, honey. This story's going to take us to some dark places, but I promise you, there's wisdom to be found in even the deepest shadows of the human heart. Now let me take you back to 1962. I was just 14 years old, living in a small town outside Nashville where everybody knew everybody's business, and secrets were currency more valuable than the dollar bills tucked away in mason jars under floorboards. My name is Margaret Rose, though back then everyone called me Maggie. I was the youngest of 4 children, born to parents who believed children should be seen and not heard, felt and not acknowledged. Daddy worked double shifts at the textile mill, and Mama spent most of her days sitting by the kitchen window, staring out at nothing, her fingers always worrying at the hem of her apron. But this story isn't really about my parents, bless their troubled souls. No, this story is about my older brother Tommy. Thomas Michael, born in 1944, 18 years old when our tale begins, with dark hair slicked back with too much pomade and eyes that never quite looked at you straight on. Tommy was what folks in those days called trouble with a capital T. You have to understand the dynamics of our household to truly grasp what happened next. Daddy was rarely home, and when he was either drunk or sleeping off being drunk. Mama existed in her own little world of medicinal sherry and soap operas on our old Zenith radio. That left Tommy as the unofficial head of the household, and me, well, I was his favourite target. It started small, the way these things always do. Tommy would eat my portion at dinner, claiming I was getting too fat anyway. He'd hide my school books, making me late and earning me switches from the teacher. He'd tell Mama lies about me, that I'd been sassing the neighbours, that I'd stolen penny candy from Miller's store, that I'd been seen talking to boys behind the church after Sunday service. But the real torture was financial. See, I had a little job cleaning for Mrs. Henderson, the widow who lived 3 houses down. Every Saturday morning I'd sweep her porch, dust her furniture, and help her tend to her vegetable garden. She paid me 50 cents each week, a fortune to a 14-year-old girl in 1962. That money represented freedom to me. Maybe a new hair ribbon, or a Coca-Cola at the drugstore counter, or even saving up for a real store-bought dress instead of the hand-me-downs I usually wore. Tommy knew about that money. Somehow, Tommy always knew. Every Saturday evening, when I'd come home with my 2 quarters clutched in my sweaty palm, Tommy would be waiting. Not obviously, you understand. He was too clever for that. He'd wait until Mama was in her room with her sherry, and Daddy was passed out in his chair, and then he'd corner me. "Maggie," he'd say, in that tone that made my stomach clench up tight, "you wouldn't want Mama to know about you stealing from Mrs. Henderson's purse, would you?" Of course, I'd never stolen a thing in my life, but Tommy had a way of making lies sound like truth, especially to parents who wanted to believe the worst about you anyway. So I'd hand over my quarters, watching my small dreams disappear into his pocket, along with my dignity. This went on for months, every week, the same routine. Mrs. Henderson would smile and press those 2 warm quarters into my palm, and every week Tommy would take them from me with that same twisted smile and another threat about what he'd tell Mama if I didn't comply. But it wasn't just the money. Oh no. Tommy was far more creative than that. He'd wait until I was getting ready for school, standing in front of our shared mirror in the hallway, trying to make something presentable out of my wild curls. Then he'd appear behind me like a shadow and start in on his daily litany. "Look at that face," he'd say, his voice just loud enough for me to hear, but quiet enough that Mama wouldn't notice. "No wonder Bobby Hutchins won't even look at you. You're uglier than a mud fence after rain." Or, "That dress makes you look like a scarecrow. Course even scarecrows serve a purpose. What purpose do you serve, Maggie?" Day after day, week after week, month after month. The words burrowed into my brain like parasites, eating away at whatever small confidence a 14-year-old girl might possess. I started avoiding mirrors, started walking with my head down, started believing that maybe, just maybe, Tommy was right about me. The worst part wasn't even what he said to me directly. No, the worst part was watching him charm everyone else in town. Tommy had a gift for making people love him, you see. He'd help Mrs. Patterson carry her groceries, always refusing the nickel she tried to give him. He'd volunteer to stack hymnals at church, standing there in his pressed shirt and clean trousers, looking like every mother's dream of what a young man should be. "That Tommy Ferguson is such a good boy," I'd hear the ladies at church whisper. His poor parents are so lucky to have such a responsible son. Meanwhile, at home, Tommy was systematically destroying every bit of joy and self-worth I possessed. The breaking point came in the spring of 1963. I was 15 by then, still cleaning for Mrs. Henderson, still handing my money over to Tommy every Saturday night. But something had begun to change in me. Maybe it was just growing up, or maybe it was the way Mrs. Henderson had started really talking to me, treating me like a person instead of just a pair of hands to clean her house. "Margaret Rose," she said one Saturday afternoon as we were sitting on her front porch sharing a pitcher of sweet tea, "you've got intelligence in those eyes. What are you planning to do with your life?" No one had ever asked me that before, not about my plans, my dreams, my future. For a moment I couldn't even speak. I don't know, Ma'am," I finally managed. Mrs. Henderson leaned forward in her rocking chair, her pale blue eyes serious behind her wire-rimmed spectacles. "Well, you better figure it out, child. Time has a way of slipping past while you're not paying attention. One day you wake up and realize you've been living someone else's life instead of your own." Those words stuck with me, started growing in my mind like seeds in fertile soil. That very evening, when Tommy approached me for his weekly tribute, something inside me finally snapped. "No," I said, clutching my 2/4 against my chest. Tommy blinked, genuinely surprised. "What did you say?" I said, "No, this is my money. I earned it." For a moment, we just stared at each other in the dim hallway light. Then Tommy's expression changed, became something darker and more dangerous than I'd ever seen before. "You ungrateful little brat," he hissed. "After everything I've done for this family, after all the times I've covered for you when Mama wanted to take the belt to you for your sass and disobedience, this is how you repay me." But I held firm. Mrs. Henderson's words were still ringing in my ears, giving me strength I didn't know I possessed. "You never covered for me," I said, my voice barely steady. "You're the one who tells Mama lies about me in the first place." Tommy's face went white, then red. For a terrifying moment I thought he might actually hit me. Instead, he leaned in close, so close I could smell the Brill cream in his hair and the cigarettes on his breath. "You have no idea what you've just done," he whispered. "No idea at all." And you know what, dear ones? He was absolutely right. I had no idea what I'd just unleashed. The next morning at breakfast, Mama was waiting for me with her jaw set in that hard line that meant trouble. "Margaret Rose Ferguson," she said, not even looking up from her coffee cup. "Mrs. Patterson called me yesterday evening. She seems to think she saw you behind Miller's store with that Jenkins boy, acting in a manner that was inappropriate for a young lady." My stomach dropped like a stone down a well. "Mamma, I wasn't—" "Don't you dare lie to me, young lady. Mrs. Patterson is a God-fearing woman who wouldn't make up such a story." I looked across the table at Tommy, who was buttering his toast with elaborate care, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Tommy," I said desperately, Tell her I was home yesterday evening. Tell her the truth." Tommy looked up then, his eyes wide and innocent as a newborn lamb's. "Gosh, Maggie, I wish I could help you, but I was at baseball practice until after dark. I have no idea where you were." The lie was so smooth, so perfectly delivered, that for a moment even I almost believed it. Mama's punishment was swift and severe. No leaving the house except for school and church, no more working for Mrs. Henderson, no pocket money for 2 months, and worst of all, a switching that left welts on my legs for a week. But Tommy wasn't finished. Oh no. Over the next few months he systematically destroyed every small pleasure in my life. When I tried to check out a book from the library, he'd somehow gotten there first and told the librarian that Mama had forbidden me from reading inappropriate material. When I was invited to a church social, anonymous phone calls would be made to other parents, suggesting that I was the kind of girl who might be a bad influence. By the time my 16th birthday rolled around, I was essentially a prisoner in my own home, friendless and beaten down, exactly as Tommy wanted me. But here's what Tommy didn't count on. Mrs. Henderson had been asking around about why I'd stopped coming to work for her, and Mrs. Henderson, bless her soul, was nobody's fool. One afternoon in late fall, she appeared at our front door, dressed in her best hat and gloves, carrying a covered dish that smelled like heaven. "Mrs. Ferguson," she said to my mama, in that sweet grandmotherly voice that could melt butter, "I brought you some of my apple cobbler. I was wondering if I might have a word with you about young Margaret Rose." What Mrs. Henderson said to my mother during that conversation, I'll never know, but whatever it was, it worked. Within an hour of Mrs. Henderson's departure, I was back to working for her on Saturdays, and some of the more ridiculous restrictions on my behaviour had been lifted. Tommy was furious, of course, but he couldn't say anything directly without revealing his own role in my persecution. Instead, he seethed in silence, and I learned to watch my back even more carefully than before. It was around this time that I began to understand something important about my brother. Tommy wasn't just mean or selfish, though he was certainly both of those things. No, Tommy was genuinely disturbed. He took actual pleasure in other people's pain, especially mine. The more I suffered, the happier he seemed to be. And slowly, quietly, something dark began to grow in my own heart in response. You see, dear ones, when someone spends years systematically destroying your spirit, you have 2 choices. You can let them break you completely, or you can learn to fight back. The problem is, when you learn to fight monsters, sometimes you become one yourself. I started small. Tommy had a favourite shirt, a blue button-down that he wore on special occasions. One day, while doing laundry, I accidentally used bleach in the wrong load. The shirt came out with white splotches all over it, completely ruined. When Tommy confronted me about it, I put on my most innocent expression, an expression I'd learned from watching him lie to our parents for years. "Oh, my goodness, Tommy," I said, my hand flying to my mouth in mock horror. "I'm so sorry. I must have mixed up the laundry. I feel terrible about it." The satisfaction I felt watching his face contort with rage and frustration was intoxicating. That's when I realised I had a talent I'd never known about. I was good at this. Good at lying, good at manipulation, good at revenge, maybe too good. Over the next few months, Tommy's life began to unravel in small ways. His favourite records got scratched. His homework assignments went missing right before they were due. The girl he was trying to court at church started receiving anonymous notes detailing some of his less savoury habits and opinions. None of it could be traced back to me, of course. I was just sweet little Maggie Ferguson, the quiet girl who kept to herself and never caused any trouble. But Tommy knew, and I knew that he knew, and for the first time in years I felt powerful. The thing about revenge, though, is that it's addictive. The more you taste it, the more you want. And I was developing quite an appetite. By my senior year of high school, I had become someone I barely recognised. On the surface, I was still the same quiet, well-behaved girl I'd always been. But underneath, I was calculating, patient, and utterly ruthless when it came to my brother. Tommy had plans to go to college on a baseball scholarship. He was actually quite good at the sport, I'll give him that much, but scholarships require good grades, and good grades require completed homework assignments. It became my mission to ensure that Tommy's academic performance suffered just enough to put his scholarship in jeopardy, but not so much that anyone would suspect sabotage, a masterclass in subtle warfare, you might say. I'd wait until he was asleep, then sneak into his room and borrow his completed assignments, replacing them with blank papers. When he'd panic the next morning, I'd be full of sympathy and suggestions about where he might have left his work. "Have you checked your gym bag, Tommy? Sometimes papers get mixed up in there." Of course, his gym bag contained nothing but the faint smell of old socks and disappointment. Or I'd volunteer to help him study for tests, then give him just slightly incorrect information, not wrong enough to be obvious, but wrong enough to cost him points. A date off by a year here, a misplaced decimal point there. Small errors that added up to big consequences. By spring semester, Tommy's grades had dropped from B's to C's and D's. His baseball coach was concerned. His teachers were puzzled by his sudden academic decline, and his scholarship was looking increasingly uncertain. But the real masterpiece came in May, just weeks before graduation. Tommy had been dating a girl named Susan Whitmore, the daughter of our town's most prominent banker. Susan was sweet, pretty, and completely naive about the kind of person my brother really was. She genuinely believed that Tommy was the upstanding young man he pretended to be in public. Now I happened to know, through careful observation and eavesdropping, that Tommy had been stepping out on Susan with a girl from the next town over, a girl whose reputation was... Well, let's just say her parents would have been horrified to know what their daughter was up to after dark. I also knew that Tommy had been bragging to his friends about his conquests, using language that would have made a sailor blush. He spoke about both girls in terms that no decent person would use about anyone, let alone young women he claimed to care about, so I made a decision. Not a good decision, mind you, but a decision nonetheless. I wrote a letter. Actually, I wrote 2 letters, both in Tommy's handwriting, a skill I'd perfected through months of practice. One letter was addressed to Susan, detailing Tommy's affair in graphic terms and explaining exactly what he really thought of her and her family. The other was addressed to the other girl, filled with equally cruel observations about her character and reputation. Then I mailed both letters, making sure they'd arrive on the same day. The explosion that followed was spectacular and terrible, and exactly what I'd hoped for. Within 24 hours, Susan's father had called our house, demanding to speak with Tommy. The conversation, conducted at a volume that carried throughout our small house, involved words like disgraceful, dishonour, and never darken our door again. The other girl's 3 older brothers appeared at our front door the following evening, looking for a discussion with Tommy about his treatment of their sister. Daddy had to step in to prevent what would have certainly been a very one-sided conversation conducted with fists instead of words. And Susan herself? Poor Susan spent the next week crying in the church pews, surrounded by the sympathy of every woman in town and the barely concealed satisfaction of every man who'd never thought Tommy Ferguson was good enough for a Whitmore girl anyway. Tommy's reputation was destroyed overnight. The golden boy who could do no wrong had become the subject of whispered conversations and knowing looks. His college prospects evaporated, his social standing crumbled, his future, as he'd envisioned it, ceased to exist. And I watched it all with a satisfaction that should have frightened me, but it didn't, not then. That summer, as Tommy struggled to find work and purpose in a town that had turned against him, I basked in the glory of my victory. Finally, after years of torment, I had won. Justice had been served. The bully had been brought low. Or so I told myself. It wasn't until years later, decades later, that I would look back on that 17-year-old girl and realise what I had actually become. In my quest to defeat a monster, I had become something far worse. because Tommy, for all his cruelty and selfishness, had been little more than a damaged boy acting out his own pain and insecurity. But me, I had planned and executed his destruction with the cold precision of a chess master, manipulating not just him, but everyone around him to achieve my goals. Tommy had been a bully, but I had become something far more dangerous. I had become calculating. And this, dear ones, is only the beginning of my story. Because what I did to Tommy in 1965 was just practice for what I would do 47 years later, when I encountered someone who made my brother look like a saint in comparison. But that part of the tale will have to wait for next time. I need to stop here and catch my breath, let these old memories settle back into their dusty corners where they belong. If this story has touched something in your heart, whether it's recognition, horror, or simple curiosity about how deep the human capacity for revenge can go, please hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Stories like this one need to be told, need to be heard, need to be remembered, because the truth about human nature isn't always pretty, but it's always honest. And sometimes honesty is the only gift we can give to the generations that come after us. I'll see you next time when I tell you about the person who would make me understand, finally and completely, what I had truly become all those years ago. Until then, take care of yourselves, dear ones, and remember, we all have monsters inside us. The question isn't whether they exist, it's whether we choose to feed them or starve them. Welcome back, dear ones. If you're just joining us, please go back and listen to the first part of this story. You'll need that context for what comes next, and I promise you, what comes next will change how you think about justice, revenge, and the price we pay for both. For those of you who've been waiting, hit that like button and get comfortable. We're about to dive into the deepest, darkest waters of the human heart. When we left off, I was 17 years old and had just orchestrated the complete social destruction of my brother Tommy. I thought I was dispensing justice. I thought I was finally free. What I didn't understand was that I had just taken my first step down a path that would define the next 55 years of my life. You see, success is a dangerous thing when it comes to revenge. It creates an appetite. And I had discovered that I was very, very good at it. Let me fast forward through the years between then and 2012, when the real story, the story that would teach me who I'd actually become, finally began. I married young, as girls did in those days. Robert Ferguson was a good man, quiet and steady, who worked as a mechanic at the Ford dealership in town. We had 3 children, Robert Jr., called Bobby, born in 1969, Sarah in 1971, and our youngest Michael in 1974. Robert Sr. died in 1998 from a heart attack. Sudden, massive, took him while he was under the hood of a 9.2 Taurus. The doctors said he probably didn't feel much pain, which was a comfort, I suppose. But his death left me with a house that was paid for, a small life insurance policy, and 3 grown children who had their own lives and problems. Bobby moved to Atlanta for work. Sarah married a man from Memphis and rarely called. And Michael? Well, Michael struggled with what folks today call addiction issues. Back then, we just called it weakness and shame. By 2012, I was living alone in that same house where I'd grown up, where Tommy had tormented me, where I'd learned to be something other than what God intended. I was 64 years old, retired from my job at the county clerk's office, surviving on Social Security and Robert's small pension. That's when Patricia Hawkins entered my life. Patricia was what you might call a professional caregiver, though that term gives her far more legitimacy than she deserved. She specialised in befriending elderly people, gaining their trust, and then, well, you can probably guess where this is going. Patricia was 52, a handsome woman with silver hair always perfectly styled, clothes that suggested taste and refinement, and a smile that could melt butter. She drove a nice car, not too fancy, mind you, but nice enough to suggest success without ostentation. She had a way of making you feel like the most interesting person in the world when she spoke with you, and she was absolutely, completely, utterly evil. She first appeared at my church in March 2012. New in town, she said, recently moved from Birmingham to be closer to her elderly aunt. She was looking for a church home, somewhere she could feel like family. She had such a sweet way of talking, such apparent genuine faith, that within a month she'd been invited to join the ladies' auxiliary and was helping with the church potluck suppers. Patricia made it her business to befriend the older, more vulnerable members of our congregation. She'd offer to drive us to doctor's appointments, help with grocery shopping, provide companionship for those long evenings when the loneliness got to be too much. I should have been suspicious. At 64, I'd lived long enough to know that people who seem too good to be true usually are. But Patricia was skilled at what she did, and I was lonely. Robert had been gone 14 years by then. My children were scattered to the winds, and the house that had once been full of life and noise had become a monument to solitude. When Patricia offered to help me with my weekly grocery shopping, I said yes. When she suggested we have coffee together after church on Sundays, I was grateful for the company. When she started calling me every evening just to check in and see how my day had gone, I felt like I'd found a daughter to replace the one who never called. It started so slowly I almost didn't notice. Patricia would casually mention that she was having trouble making ends meet. Her aunt's medical bills were overwhelming, or her car needed expensive repairs, or her rent had gone up unexpectedly. She never asked for money directly. She was far too clever for that. Instead, she'd wait for me to offer, and like a fool I did. "Patricia, honey," I'd say, reaching for my purse, "let me help you with that car repair. It's the least I can do after all the kindness you've shown me." "Oh, Margaret Rose, I couldn't possibly—" nonsense. What's money for if not to help the people we care about? $20 here, 50 there. Small amounts that didn't seem significant at the time. Patricia would always protest, always insist she'd pay me back as soon as she got on her feet. And I believed her, because I wanted to believe her. By summer, the amounts had grown larger. Patricia's aunt needed surgery. Could I possibly lend her $300? Patricia's landlord was threatening eviction unless she could come up with first and last month's rent. Would I consider helping with $800? Each time, Patricia presented documentation, medical bills, eviction notices, repair estimates, all very official looking, all apparently legitimate. I should mention here that I wasn't wealthy, not by any stretch. Robert's insurance and pension, combined with my social security, gave me enough to live comfortably, but not extravagantly. The money I was lending to Patricia was coming out of the small savings account I'd been building up for emergencies and end-of-life expenses. But Patricia made me feel needed, appreciated, loved. When you're a lonely old woman, those feelings are worth almost any price. The first time I tried to reach Patricia to ask about repayment, her phone had been disconnected. When I asked at church, I was told she'd moved again. Family emergency back in Birmingham. She'd left a message saying she'd be in touch soon to arrange repayment of her debts. That was August 2012. By then, Patricia Hawkins had borrowed, stolen, really, just over $4,000 from me. Money I couldn't afford to lose. Money that represented years of careful budgeting and sacrifice. But I wasn't the only one. As word spread through the congregation, we discovered that Patricia had worked her way through most of the elderly members of our church. Mrs. Coleman had lost nearly $6,000. Mr. Jeffers had signed over the title to his truck as collateral for a loan that was never repaid. Mrs. Patterson, yes, the same Mrs. Patterson who'd caused me so much trouble as a teenager, had been convinced to cash out a small certificate of deposit to help with Patricia's aunt's medical expenses. In total, Patricia Hawkins had stolen nearly $30,000 from members of our small church. $30,000 from people who could least afford to lose it, people who had trusted her because she'd convinced them she was family. The police were sympathetic, but not particularly helpful. Patricia Hawkins was probably not even her real name. The address she'd given turned out to be a mail drop service. The documentation she'd shown us was expertly forged. She was almost certainly a professional con artist who specialised in targeting religious communities and elderly people. "These cases are very difficult to prosecute," the detective explained to us. "She's probably moved on to another state, another identity, another group of victims. I'm sorry, but your money is almost certainly gone forever." That night I sat in my kitchen, staring at my bank statement and trying to figure out how I was going to manage. $4,000 might not sound like much to younger folks, but when you're living on a fixed income, it might as well be $4 million. But more than the money, what hurt was the betrayal. Patricia had made me believe that she cared about me, that our friendship was real. She'd listened to my stories, shared my meals, held my hand during the difficult moments when grief for Robert would sneak up on me unexpectedly. And it had all been an act. Every moment, every conversation, every gesture of affection, all of it calculated to separate me from my money. That's when the old feeling started coming back. The same cold fury I'd felt toward Tommy all those years ago, the same calculating patience, the same absolute determination to see justice done, no matter what it cost. But I was 74 years old now, not 17. I had resources I'd never possessed as a teenager. I had time, money, and most importantly, I had learned over the decades how to be very, very patient. So I began to hunt Patricia Hawkins. It took me 3 months to find her, 3 months of phone calls, internet searches, and what you might call detective work. I hired a private investigator, a luxury I couldn't really afford, but an investment in justice that felt necessary. Her real name was Patricia Ann Morrison. She was 54, not 52, and she had been running this particular con for over 15 years. She had warrants out for her arrest in Alabama, Georgia, and Florida. She was currently operating in a small town outside Knoxville, Tennessee, having ingratiated herself with a Methodist congregation there. The private investigator provided me with an address, a phone number, and most importantly, detailed information about her current scheme. She was working on an elderly widower named Harold Sinclair, a retired school principal whose wife had died the previous year. According to the investigator's report, she'd already gotten nearly $2,000 from Mr. Sinclair for her sick grandmother's medical treatments. I had a choice to make. I could turn this information over to the police and hope they'd be able to build a case against her. I could contact Mr. Sinclair and warn him about what Patricia really was, or I could handle it myself. You can probably guess which option I chose. I spent 2 weeks planning. First, I needed to understand Patricia's current identity and circumstances. According to the investigator, she was living in a small apartment under the name Patricia Hawthorne, claiming to be recently divorced and struggling to rebuild her life. She'd been attending the Methodist Church for about 6 weeks and had already established herself as a pillar of the community. Then I began my campaign. It started with anonymous letters, not to Patricia. That would have simply caused her to move on to the next town, the next group of victims. No, the letters went to other members of her new congregation, warning them about a con artist who was targeting elderly church members in communities across the South. The letters included specific details about Patricia's methods, her false identities, and most damning of all, photocopies of the forged documents she'd used to steal money from our church. I was very careful to make the letters untraceable. Different typewriters, different paper, mailed from different cities when I was visiting relatives or running errands. Within a week, I began to hear through my network of church friends that there was concern about the new woman at the Methodist Church in Knoxville. People were asking questions, comparing stories, beginning to see patterns they'd missed before. But that wasn't enough for me. Patricia had stolen $4,000 from me and $30,000 from my friends and church family. A little suspicion wasn't sufficient payment for that kind of betrayal, so I escalated. I drove to Knoxville. At 74, I was still mobile and alert, still capable of executing a plan that required patience and precision. I rented a room at a small motel and began surveillance. For 3 days, I watched Patricia's routine. She left her apartment every morning at 9:30, usually to run errands or meet with her target, Harold Sinclair. She returned home around 4 in the afternoon. She attended church services and activities Wednesday evenings and twice on Sundays. On the 4th day, while Patricia was at her Wednesday evening Bible study, I broke into her apartment. Now, before you judge me too harshly, remember what this woman had done. She had systematically robbed elderly people of their life savings. She had betrayed the trust of people who had opened their hearts and homes to her. She was continuing to do it and would keep doing it until someone stopped her. The apartment was neat, well organised, and completely false. Patricia Hawthorne's identity was as carefully constructed as Patricia Hawkins had been, but I wasn't there for her personal effects. I was there for her files. Patricia kept meticulous records, and I found them hidden in a false bottom of her bedroom dresser. Names, addresses, phone numbers, and detailed notes about dozens of elderly victims across multiple states. Financial information, family relationships, personal vulnerabilities, everything she needed to manipulate and rob people who had trusted her. But more than that, I found evidence of crimes that went far beyond simple theft. There were forged wills, fraudulent insurance claims, and what appeared to be documentation of identity theft on a massive scale. This woman wasn't just a con artist, she was a criminal enterprise operating as a single person. I photographed everything, every document, every page of notes, every scrap of evidence that could be used to build a case against her. Then I put everything back exactly as I'd found it and left the apartment. The next phase required patience and careful timing. Over the next month, I systematically destroyed Patricia's current operation while building a comprehensive case against her. I contacted victims from other states, gathering sworn statements and documentation of her crimes. I worked with law enforcement agencies in multiple jurisdictions, providing evidence and testimony that connected Patricia to frauds spanning nearly 2 decades. But I also did something else, something that went beyond justice and crossed the line into the kind of cold, calculated revenge that had defined my relationship with Tommy all those years ago. I destroyed her personally. Using the information I'd found in her apartment, I contacted Patricia's ex-husband, her real ex-husband, not the fictional one she'd created for her current identity. I told him where she was, what she was doing, and provided him with evidence that she'd been forging his signature on financial documents for years after their divorce. I contacted her estranged daughter, a woman in her 30s who had been trying to find her mother for over a decade. I told her where Patricia was and what she'd become. I contacted every landlord, every employer, every professional reference Patricia had used in the past 5 years. I made sure they all knew exactly who and what they'd been dealing with. By December 2012, Patricia's world had completely collapsed. She'd been arrested on multiple warrants, her assets had been frozen, and her various identities had been exposed. She was facing potential prison sentences in 4 different states, but that still wasn't enough for me. While Patricia sat in jail awaiting trial, I began contacting the families of her other victims, not to offer comfort or support, but to provide them with detailed information about how to pursue civil lawsuits against her. I helped them organise, helped them find lawyers, helped them coordinate their efforts to ensure that Patricia would face financial ruin even if she managed to avoid significant prison time. I spent nearly 18 months orchestrating Patricia Morrison's complete destruction. By the time I was finished, she had lost everything: her freedom, her money, her false identities, her ability to ever run this kind of con again. And I felt satisfied, more than satisfied. I felt vindicated. The night after Patricia was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison, I stood in my kitchen, holding the newspaper article about her conviction. I felt the same dark satisfaction I'd experienced watching Tommy's life fall apart 47 years earlier. That's when I looked up and saw myself reflected in the kitchen window. Really saw myself, maybe for the first time in decades. The face staring back at me wasn't the face of a victim who had sought justice. It wasn't the face of an elderly woman who had protected her community from a predator. It was the face of someone who had taken pleasure in another person's complete destruction. Someone who had gone far beyond justice into something much darker and more personal. Patricia Morrison deserved to face consequences for her crimes. She deserved to be stopped, to be punished, to lose the ability to hurt other people. But did she deserve what I had done to her? Did she deserve to have her entire existence systematically dismantled by someone who took genuine satisfaction in her suffering? That's when I realized the truth about what I had become. In my quest to defeat the monsters who had hurt me, first Tommy, then Patricia, I had become something far worse than either of them had ever been. Tommy had been a bully, cruel and small-minded. Patricia had been a thief and a liar. But I had become something that carefully planned the complete destruction of human beings and felt joy in their suffering. I had become a monster myself. The worst part wasn't the realization. The worst part was that even knowing what I'd become, I couldn't honestly say I regretted what I'd done. Patricia Morrison had hurt people I cared about. She had betrayed trust, stolen money, and caused real suffering to elderly people who couldn't afford to lose what she took. If I had to do it again, I think I would make the same choices, and that, dear ones, is what truly frightened me. I spent the next few months trying to understand how I'd gotten to this place. How a 14-year-old girl who just wanted to keep her 50 cents of cleaning money had become a 74-year-old woman who could orchestrate someone's complete destruction and sleep peacefully afterward. The answer, I think, lies in something Mrs. Henderson told me all those years ago, though I didn't understand it at the time. "Margaret Rose," she'd said, "time has a way of slipping past while you're not paying attention. One day you wake up and realize you've been living someone else's life instead of your own." I had spent so many years focused on fighting the people who hurt me that I'd never stopped to ask who I wanted to be. I'd defined myself in opposition to others. I was not weak like my mother, not cruel like Tommy, not vulnerable like Patricia's victims. But I'd never defined myself as something positive, something good. I was 74 years old, and I had no idea who Margaret Rose Ferguson actually was underneath all the armour I built up over the decades. That realisation was the beginning of my real transformation. Not the kind of transformation that comes from defeating your enemies, but the much harder kind that comes from defeating yourself. I began by making amends where I could. I contacted some of Patricia's victims and helped them get connected with victim services and counselling resources. I made anonymous donations to organisations that help elderly people avoid financial scams. More importantly, I began the slow work of learning how to be something other than a weapon. I started volunteering at the local literacy centre, teaching adults how to read. I began visiting patients at the nursing home, just sitting with people who were lonely and forgotten. I got involved with Meals on Wheels, delivering food to homebound seniors. For the first time in my adult life, I was using my intelligence and my stubbornness for something constructive instead of destructive. And slowly, gradually, I began to discover who I might have been if I'd never learned to fight monsters by becoming one myself. I was actually quite good at teaching reading. I had patience for people who struggled with learning, and I never made them feel ashamed of what they didn't know. I enjoyed the moment when understanding would dawn in someone's eyes, when letters would finally form words, and words would finally form meaning. I was good at sitting with dying people. I wasn't afraid of their pain or their fear, and I didn't feel compelled to offer false comfort or empty platitudes. I could just be present, just be witness to their experience without trying to fix or change anything. I was good at listening. Years of calculating what people wanted to hear had taught me how to really pay attention to what they were saying. But now, instead of using that skill to manipulate, I was using it to understand, to comfort, to connect. I'm 82 years old now, and I've spent the last 10 years learning how to be Margaret Rose Ferguson instead of someone else's victim or enemy. It's been harder work than anything I've ever done. including orchestrating Patricia Morrison's downfall. Because it's relatively easy to tear someone else's life apart. It requires intelligence, patience, and determination, but those are skills I'd always possessed. Learning how to build a life, learning how to create instead of destroy, learning how to find satisfaction in someone else's success instead of someone else's failure. That's the hardest thing I've ever attempted. I still don't know if I'm a good person. I suspect that question became unanswerable the moment I made my first conscious choice to hurt someone else, even if that someone else was my brother Tommy. But I think I might finally be becoming a real person, someone who exists for her own reasons instead of in reaction to other people's actions. And maybe, at 82 years old, that's enough. If you've stayed with me through this long, difficult story, thank you. I know it wasn't easy to hear, and it certainly wasn't easy to tell. The truth about human nature isn't comfortable. We all have the capacity for both great good and great evil, often within the same heart, sometimes within the same moment. The question isn't whether we're good people or bad people. It's whether we're conscious of our choices and willing to take responsibility for their consequences. I became a monster because I let my pain and anger make my choices for me. I stayed a monster because I found satisfaction in other people's suffering, even when those people deserved to suffer. I'm trying not to be a monster anymore, not because I've suddenly become good, but because I've finally learned that I want to be something else, something better, something that creates instead of destroys. Whether I'll succeed? Well, I suppose that remains to be seen. Hit that subscribe button if this story has meant something to you. Ring the notification bell if you want to hear more tales from a generation that lived through things most people can't imagine. And remember, dear ones, we all have monsters inside us. The question isn't whether they exist, it's whether we choose to feed them or starve them. Take care of yourselves, and take care of each other. Because in the end, that might be the only thing that saves any of us from becoming what we fight against.